A small coal crew dug into a dry hill outside a forgotten train track, living on beans, hard bread, and the hope of steady winter pay. The work was normal until their tools broke into a hidden pocket of empty space deep under the hill. Strange marks in the dust, carvings in light-colored stone, air that hadn't moved in forever. That night, the ground began tapping from below the bunkhouse floor. Whatever lived beneath that hill was not sleeping anymore. So, before we continue, please make sure you leave a like and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. I still remember the taste of coal dust on my tongue that winter in 1906 and the way it covered my mouth no matter how much water I drank. We were 30 miles outside a small Nevada camp that doesn't exist anymore, a strip of wooden buildings and canvas tents around a narrow train track. Men called it dry camp number 3. To me, it was only a row of thin walls that shook in the wind and a bed where my feet stuck out into cold air. I had come from Utah that fall, looking for steady pay. The copper mines had let men go, and I heard that the coal under the Nevada hills was thick and close to the top. By the time I arrived, crews were already cutting into a low hill of gray stone that rose behind camp. The company manager, a short man named Briggs with a heavy watch chain, said we would be rich in a year and gone in 2. He always smiled when he said it, though I never saw him go down into the mine tunnels. There were 6 men in my crew. I slept beside a tall Irishman named Connolly, whose beard never grew evenly and left pale patches on his cheeks. He made rough jokes and hummed while he worked. Next to him slept a Mexican worker named Alvarez, who had worked silver in Virginia City and said this coal smelled strange to him, too dry and sour. There was a young boy we called Sparrow, no more than 16, who lied and said he was 18 so the company would hire him. He had quick hands and wide eyes that tried to look older than they were. The last 2 were brothers from Kansas, Eli and Thomas Ward, broad in the shoulders, quiet men who smoked cheap tobacco and kept to themselves. Our days were simple at first. We woke before dawn, ate beans and rough bread in the cookhouse, and walked the narrow track up to the opening of the main tunnel. A dark opening cut into the hillside, framed by rough wood and stacked rocks. The air inside was cold and still. Lamps hung on nails near the entrance, and each of us took one, checked the wick, and lit it before stepping into the tunnel. The light always looked thin in there and stopped quickly against the rock, but it was enough to see the tracks and the rough-cut walls. Those first weeks passed in the usual way. We cut, loaded carts, and pushed them back to the surface where the mule team pulled them to the dumping area. There were roof falls and bad tempers and the kind of arguments that happen when men work in closed spaces, but nothing worse than what you find in any mine. If anyone spoke about stories the Shoshone families told around their winter fires, I did not hear it. All I knew was that they kept away from the hill and watched us from a distance when they came to trade. It was Alvarez who first mentioned hidden spaces in the hill. One evening after supper, a cold wind came down off the hill and drove most of the men into the bunkhouse. The lanterns swung on their hooks, and the stove in the center glowed red. Alvarez sat on the edge of his bed with his boots off, rolling his shoulders, and said the coal was not lying right in the hill. He said there were empty spaces behind the coal layer, hollow places that changed the sound of the pick when you struck. Old rock with holes, he said in his rough English. The hill is not solid. It has many empty places. Connolly laughed and asked what was supposed to have made those holes. Alvarez only shrugged and looked at the floorboards. Sparrow listened with a serious face, the way a boy listens when he wants men to think he is grown. 2 days later, we hit the first pocket. We were 100 yards in by then. Following the cold air downward, the air had grown warmer and heavy with wetness. My shirt stuck to my back while I swung the pick, and the lamplight shook with every strike. I remember hearing a dull change in the sound, a hollow note, and then my pick broke through into open space. Cold air rushed over my hands, dry and stale from long imprisonment in the rock. We all stopped at once. For a moment, there was only the hiss of our lamps and the slow drip of water somewhere in the distance. Then Connolly stepped up beside me, held his lamp near the hole, and looked through. On the other side was darkness, deeper than the tunnel around us. We made the opening bigger with care, knocking away chunks of coal until a man could squeeze through. Briggs came down not long after we sent Sparrow to fetch him. He arrived in a clean shirt with a scarf around his neck and a lamp that had never seen coal dust. He looked into the gap, sniffed the air, and asked how far the empty space might go. None of us could say. He rubbed his chin and told us not to stand there guessing. He wanted a survey of the empty space before the next shift. If it was large, he said, they might add wooden supports and use it for storage. If it led deeper into the hill, they could drive a new tunnel and open more of the coal layer. The Shoshone interpreter, who sometimes came to camp, must have heard about the discovery. That evening, he stood outside the cookhouse with two elders, watching the lamps burn at the tunnel opening. I saw Briggs speak with him for a short time. They exchanged a few words, and Briggs waved his hand in a sharp motion that ended the talk. The interpreter left without coming in for coffee. When we went to bed that night, the bunkhouse felt colder than usual. The wind pushed at the walls and sent fine dust through the cracks. We gathered at first light and walked up the track without much talk. Ice covered the rails and made them shine white in the lamplight. At the opening of the tunnel, the wooden beams were damp and rough to the touch. We checked our lamps and went in. The air was colder near the entrance and warmed as we moved downhill. My hands felt tight around the handle of my pick, and I could hear Sparrow breathing behind me, slow and careful. At the pocket we had opened, the cut edge showed hard coal around a black gap. Connolly bent down and held his lamp close. The flame bent toward the empty space, then steadied. He looked back at us and said the air beyond was still. Briggs arrived moments later with a coil of rope and a chalkboard for notes. He told us to keep our heads and follow instructions. He wanted 3 men through the opening, while the rest made it wider and kept the rope secure. He chose me, Connolly, and Thomas Ward to go first. Alvarez shook his head once, but said nothing when Briggs told him to stay with the support crew. We stripped down to avoid snagging on rough edges, slung the rope over our shoulders, and eased through. Coal scraped my back and left dust in my mouth. On the other side, I stood in a low room with a floor of packed dirt. The ceiling was close enough that I had to bend. The beam from my lamp showed the walls reaching away in a curve. The space had a dry smell, old and sour. My breath felt heavier at once. I called back to say we were clear. Connolly and Thomas joined me. We tied the rope to a stub of rock and moved along the wall. The room got wider into an oval shape. In the center stood a column of light-colored stone that did not match the coal around it. Its surface was smooth and hard with shallow lines cut across it in a pattern I did not recognize. Thomas ran his fingers over it and said it was not natural. We all stepped back without meaning to. The pattern did not look like writing I knew, and it did not look like random cracks. I walked around the column and found a narrow passage leading away at a slight downward angle. The walls there were not smooth. They showed uneven marks as though many tool edges had worked there for a long time. The edges were not clean. They had small chips that showed hard hands and repetition. My lamp showed small piles of dust under some of the ridges. The floor had shallow dents that formed a trail. The shape was not a boot heel and not a hoof. Each dent had a long end and 2 shorter ends that curved. I bent down and touched one with my fingers. The edge was crisp, not old. Connolly called me back to the column. He had found something on the ground near its base. It was a strip of light-colored material that bent without breaking. One side was smooth and dry. The other had small ridges and a regular pattern. He lifted it and held it near his lamp. The surface caught the light in a dull way. He said it felt like a skin of some kind. Thomas frowned and told him to put it down. Connolly set it on a rock and wiped his hands on his pants. We heard the rest of our crew coming through the opening. Their lamps added more light and threw long shadows across the room. Briggs entered last and walked straight to the column. He ran his hand over the carvings, then stood back and told Sparrow to draw what he saw onto the chalkboard. Sparrow's hand shook a little, but he drew the lines with care. Alvarez stood near the narrow passage and watched the darkness, his face still. Briggs asked about the marks on the floor. I pointed them out. He bent down and followed them with his eyes to where they turned into the passage. He told Eli Ward to bring two wooden beams and set them at the entrance to hold up the roof. Eli went back through the opening with Alvarez to get the wood. While they were gone, we set up a simple anchor for the rope around the column and took a length with us. Briggs wanted the three of us and Sparrow to go into the passage, while he and the others made the room wider and took measurements. We moved single file with me in front. The passage sloped down and curved right. The walls were close and our shoulders brushed them. The floor held more of the same dents, and in a few spots there were drag marks between them. I stopped and pressed my palm to the groove. It was shallow but straight. Connolly whispered that the air felt warmer. I noticed it then. My lamp burned steadier, and my skin felt damp. We came to a fork. The branch on the left had a low ceiling and a strong smell, sharp and mineral. The branch on the right dropped away more steeply and carried a faint flow of air that touched my face. I listened and thought I heard a soft clatter somewhere far below. Not loud, more like small stones tapping together in a slow rhythm. Sparrow heard it too. He swallowed and shifted his grip on the chalkboard. We chose the right branch because of the moving air. The rope paid out behind us to the room. I marked the wall at the fork with a notch and kept going. After 20 yards, the passage got wider into another room smaller than the first. The ceiling rose. The floor held scattered pieces of light-colored material in thin shapes. I knelt and picked one up. It crumbled under my fingers and left a dusty residue. The smell here was stronger, close to the smell near the left branch, but not as strong. Connolly's lamp showed dark stains and patches on the floor. They were old and dry. Sparrow pointed to the far wall, where narrow vertical grooves ran from floor to shoulder height. The grooves were smooth and evenly spaced. At the base of one lay a simple pile of stones arranged in a ring with black residue in the center. I touched the residue, and it smudged my fingertip. The ring was not big enough for our kind of fire. It looked more like a spot for heating small things. There were thin bones near it, brittle and hollow. I did not recognize the animal. We did not speak for a minute. The soft clatter far below came again, then stopped. I felt the hair rise on my forearms. Sparrow whispered that we should turn back and tell Briggs. I agreed. We marked the room in our notes, looked at the walls again, and went out the way we had come. At the fork, the smell from the left branch was stronger than before, and the air felt wetter. I made a new notch, and we started back. In the first room, Alvarez and Eli had set the wooden support and were cutting wedges. Briggs stood with Thomas, counting his steps around the column. He looked up when we entered and asked what we found. We told him about the lower room, the stone ring, the grooves in the wall, and the old stains. He asked about the sound. I said, it came and went. He nodded and told us we would need to push farther on the next pass. He spoke in an even tone and kept his eyes on the chalkboard. Sparrow's lines came out neat and simple. We worked for 2 more hours holding up the entrance, measuring the main room, and taking note of the carvings. Riggs told us not to spread talk around camp. He said men quit when they did not understand something. He said the company would bring in a proper surveyor soon, and that would settle things. He did not say when. On our way out, Alvarez bent down and picked up the strip Connolly had found. He sniffed it, held it close to his cheek, and then set it down again. He did not look at any of us. Outside, the wind had risen, and a fine grit moved across the ground. We walked back to camp with our heads down, lamps covered. That evening, the Shoshone interpreter came again, this time with only one elder. They waited near the cookhouse door until Briggs arrived. I stood close enough to hear. The elder spoke in a low voice, and the interpreter translated. He said the hill held old rooms that were better left alone. He said the hunters did not walk near there in winter because something moved when the earth slept. Briggs told him the company had work to do. The elder lifted his hand once, palm outward, and then left with the interpreter without taking coffee. Sparrow sat with me in the bunkhouse after supper. He cleaned his lamp glass with a rag and asked if I believed the elder. I told him I did not know what to believe yet. Connolly pretended not to listen, but kept his eyes on us. Alvarez sat on his bed and sharpened his small knife with steady strokes. The Ward brothers played cards with low voices. I woke before dawn to a sound I could not place. It was not wind or the creak of the walls. It was a dry churning from the direction of the hill. Faint, but even. It went on for several breaths and then stopped. No one else stirred. I lay still until the stove snapped as the iron cooled. Then I slept again. In the morning, Briggs assigned a new order. He wanted Thomas to lead the next push with me and Connolly behind, Sparrow to record, Alvarez and Eli to carry wooden beams, and the rest to haul waste rock. He carried a small pistol under his coat that I had not seen before. He caught me looking and said it was company property. We gathered our gear and went up the track. Inside the hill, the air felt warmer than the day before. A faint dust hung in the lamps and moved in flows. At the fork, we turned right again and followed our marks. The lower room looked the same, except for one thing. The ring of stones had been disturbed. A few pieces leaned outward, and the black residue showed a new smear that was darker at the edges. Connolly swore under his breath. Sparrow's pencil paused over the board and then moved again. We stood still for a long moment and listened. The soft clatter rose through the floor closer than before. It came in pairs with a pause between them. Alvarez took one step toward the far wall and stopped. He had gone pale. He pointed at the floor near the grooves. There, in the dust, a new set of dents crossed over our footprints. They led from the far wall to the passage and down into the dark. The edges were sharp. The dust had a faint ripple where something had dragged. Riggs told us to hold our positions. He took a knee and looked at the marks without touching them. He stood and said we would go forward a short distance and then return to report. He chose only me and Thomas to go with him. Connolly told Sparrow to keep drawing. Alvarez backed toward the passage and set his lamp on a rock for more light. We pulled the rope tight and stepped into the deeper throat of the hill. We moved in slow steps. The passage narrowed and forced us to turn sideways for a stretch. Our lamps shook a little because we tried not to breathe loud. The air felt heavier the farther we went. It made my chest feel tight. My boots touched loose grit that shifted under my soles and made a dry clicking sound. Briggs kept his hand on his coat where the pistol sat. Thomas held his lamp out in front, arm locked straight. The walls changed texture after we went down 10 more yards. Coal gave way to a darker stone that had thin veins of a gray mineral running in irregular paths. It did not reflect lamplight. It swallowed it. Past that point, the sound beneath our feet was steady, the same two-tap pattern with a pause. No change in rhythm, no change in direction. It made me think of something working at a task in patience. We reached another room. This one was tall enough that the lamplight did not reach the ceiling. The floor was dry. The rock under our boots was smooth and hard. There were piles of broken stone in the corners, each no higher than a man's waist. Some pieces were thin and curved. Others were short and bulky. None were cold. They were too pale. There was something in that room that made my skin crawl. It was not a feeling of being watched. It was a feeling that we were trespassing on ground that was already in use by something that had left only moments before. There were no carved columns, no symbols, just a single low trough carved into the floor that ran from near the entrance to the opposite wall. The trough had dried residue along its length. Thomas bent down to look closer and froze in place. Briggs knelt beside him and leaned in. He reached his thumb down and touched the residue. His face went stiff when he lifted it. The residue was red, not faded, not dusty, red. He hissed a breath and told us to go back. We did not argue. We backed out the way we came, careful to not drag the rope. When we returned to the lower room, the others were exactly where we left them. Sparrow held the chalkboard against his chest, eyes wide. Alvarez had not moved from the rock where he placed his lamp. Connolly had his pick in both hands like he expected something to rush from the dark. Briggs told everyone to return to the first room. He did not raise his voice. He did not panic. He only spoke in short words and clear orders. He told Sparrow to take the board, and he told Alvarez and Eli to bring the wooden beams. We moved in a single file line up the passage. When we reached the first room, Briggs told us to gather around him. He said we would seal the passage until a survey team arrived. He said we would tell no one outside this crew until the company decided what to say. He said what was inside the lower room was not our concern anymore. The Ward brothers nodded without speaking. Alvarez turned away and wiped cold dust from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. Connolly stared at the floor until Briggs told him to look him in the eye and confirmed that he understood. When we reached the tunnel opening, daylight felt strange. It was too bright. The cold air outside felt thin. The hill behind us looked like any other hill, but it now had weight in my mind that it did not have before. We walked down the track to camp in silence. Men outside looked at us with questions on their faces, but none spoke. Briggs went straight to his office and closed the door. That night, the bunkhouse felt tense. Men moved quietly and spoke in low voices. Sparrow lay on his bed and stared up at the rafters. Connolly sat on the edge of his bed and rubbed his hands together over and over like someone trying to get something off his skin. Alvarez prayed quietly in Spanish. The Ward brothers smoked and said nothing. I sat on my bed and tried to put the shape of those dents in my mind next to every print I knew of in the natural world. None matched. All I had was uncertainty that settled into a dull ache in my chest. 2 hours after lights out, I woke to the same dry two-tap sound I heard before dawn. It was louder now. It came in steady rhythm from the direction of the hill. I stepped outside and saw the other men standing there too, scattered in silence outside their doorways. We all heard it. It was not wind or rockfall. It was deliberate. It went on for several minutes, then stopped with no fade out. At dawn, we walked up the track again, but Briggs stopped us at the tunnel opening. He said the company would halt all underground work until the survey team arrived. The work crews would shift to expanding the dumping area and clearing waste rock. I saw anger in some of the men who had not gone inside the hill. One said, "We found gold, and we're hiding it." Another said, "The Shoshone cursed the hill." Briggs told them to keep their mouths shut and do what they were paid to do. The next 2 days were slow and restless. The tap came every night and sometimes in short bursts during the afternoon. The men who had never gone into the hill grew irritable. Sparrow lost weight fast. Alvarez refused to step foot near the hill. Connolly started drinking early in the morning. The Ward brothers watched the hill from behind the tool shed and said nothing at all. On the third night, the taps came closer. Instead of coming from deep under the hill, the sound seemed to move toward camp. It was still faint, but no longer distant. It carried through the cold air like something steady and patient closing distance. I was outside when it happened. The sky was clear and full of stars. The sound grew loud enough to make men look at each other with a kind of silent agreement that we had crossed a line. We formed a small group near the tool shed. Sparrow stood between me and Connolly. Alvarez stood behind us near the wall. The Ward brothers moved to the front and listened with their hands on their belts. The tap stopped. The silence that followed had weight. Then the sound came again, but this time from under our feet. A single dry scrape close to the tool shed door. A second scrape near the bunkhouse foundation. We all stepped back. Briggs came out of his office with the pistol drawn. He did not shout for men to calm down or return to their beds. He only asked where the sound came from. Thomas pointed at the ground near the shed wall. Briggs raised the pistol and told everyone to stand clear. The ground under the shed gave a single sharp click like stone on bone. Then silence. Briggs lowered the pistol and told everyone to get back inside. He said we would form an armed watch until dawn. He said nothing else. The men obeyed because there was no alternative thought left to cling to. I sat awake for most of that night with my lamp burning low and my back against the bunkhouse wall. My chest hurt every time I breathed in. Sparrow sat on his bed staring at the door. I tried closing my eyes, but the memory of that lower room came back every time. The trough, the red residue, the new dents in the dust. We were not alone in that hill. That much had become certain. Briggs divided us into pairs for the watch. I was with Connolly. We took the first shift outside near the tool shed. The night air felt dry and sharp, and the stars looked washed out. Our lamp sat on a crate between us. Conley rested his pick handle across his knees. He whispered that he had worked mines since he was a boy, and nothing ever felt like this. He said every mine had its own smell, its own sound, its own mood, but this was something separate from any place men had cut. He said it felt like the hill had its own order, and we had disturbed it. I did not answer. I did not trust my voice. We kept watch for 2 hours and heard nothing. There was no wind, no taps, no scrape, just a still quiet that made every breath feel too loud. When our shift ended, the Ward brothers relieved us. I went back inside and tried to sleep again, but could not. The stove had gone low, and the coal sat heavy in the bunkhouse. Sparrow had not slept at all. He sat with his back against the log wall, and his knees pulled up to his chest. At dawn, the cook rang the bell for breakfast, but only half the men came to eat. Some had not slept. Some were afraid to step outside. Briggs ordered the miners, who had not gone inside the hill, to continue moving waste rock. He told our small group to stay near camp and rest until the survey crew arrived. He did not know when that would be. He only said they were coming from Ely by rail, but Ely was days away. We remained near the bunkhouse most of that day. No one wanted to go near the tunnel opening. The men who moved waste rock cursed under their breath and kept looking toward the hill. The Shoshone elder and the interpreter returned near noon. They stood far from the camp until Briggs approached. I saw Briggs speak with them again. This time, the elder shook his head in a slow way, like someone watching a door close that should never have been opened. He placed a small pouch wrapped in hide on the ground and gestured for Briggs to leave it there. Briggs refused. He kicked the pouch aside and walked away. That night, the taps returned, but now they came in irregular bursts. 3 taps, a pause. 2 taps, a long silence. 4 taps. Each strike felt carried by intention. We all gathered outside the bunkhouse and listened. Briggs stood there too with the pistol in hand. He told us to get inside. We moved fast this time. No one argued. It was after midnight when the first scream jolted every man upright. It came from outside near the dumping area. I ran to the door with Conley and Sparrow behind me. When we stepped into the cold, we saw Eli Ward running toward camp. His arms flailed and his eyes were wide. His voice broke in his throat as he tried to tell us something. His words made no sense. He kept pointing back toward the hill. Thomas ran to him, grabbed his shoulders, and tried to calm him. But Eli began clawing at his own shirt, then at his throat, as if something inside would not let him speak. He collapsed in front of us and lay still. When I knelt beside him, his chest was not moving. His eyes were open and looking straight up. Thomas stared down at his brother and shook in a slow, rigid way. He did not cry. He did not shout. He put his hand on Ellie's chest, left it there, and then looked at Briggs without expression. Briggs told us to carry the body to the tool shed until morning. We placed him on a work table near the back. Thomas stood outside the door and refused to leave. None of us tried to pull him away. When dawn came, Briggs wanted to bury Eli. Thomas refused. He said we needed to wait for the survey crew so they could see everything. Briggs argued that the Nevada sun could rot a man in days, but Thomas would not give the body up. Briggs finally agreed to leave Eli where he lay. By noon that day, another change took hold in camp. The ground near the tunnel opening showed new marks, not tracks on the surface. Deep, narrow gouges in the dirt like something sharp had been dragged toward the entrance. The marks were not wide. They were thin and even. They led right to the tunnel opening and then vanished under the wooden beams. Briggs ordered us all to stay back. He had the men who never went inside the hill gather their things and leave on foot toward the nearest rail camp 20 miles away. The company would not allow it if they found out, but Briggs no longer seemed to care. He told them they would not be paid for the last week, but they did not argue. They packed and walked away fast without looking back. Our group remained. Me, Connolly, Alvarez, Sparrow, Thomas Ward, Briggs. 6 men now. We spent the day inside the bunkhouse with the windows blocked. The taps began again at dusk and grew louder than any night before. The floorboards creaked from subtle vibration. Sparrow flinched with every strike. Briggs sat at the table with the pistol beside him and never looked away from the door. Near midnight, the sound stopped. The sudden silence made every breath feel dangerous. In the quiet, a new sound came. A faint scrape on wood outside the bunkhouse door. Then a second scrape. Connolly whispered for us not to move. Briggs raised the pistol. Sparrow gripped my forearm so hard his nails dug into my skin. Something pressed lightly on the door. The wood bent inward, not enough to break, enough to show force. Briggs aimed center mass at the panel. The pressure relaxed. The scrape moved toward the window. The glass made a soft flexing sound like a fingertip sliding across its surface. Thomas whispered his brother's name, not out of hope, out of instinct. He held the knife he had sharpened earlier. The scrape stopped. The hill went dead silent. Then the two-tap rhythm began again. But this time it came from the cellar beneath the floor. Briggs fired a single shot straight into the boards beneath him. The sound that rose back up from the cellar was a low rattling exhale that did not match any human throat. At dawn, the taps ended. The cellar went quiet. No scrape, no pressure on the wood, nothing. When we stepped outside, the ground around the bunkhouse showed fresh dents in the dirt, the same shape as the ones in the lower room, narrow at one end, wider at the other, with shallow ridges on each side. They formed a ring around the bunkhouse, spaced evenly in perfect patience. I realized then that we were being measured. We stayed close together that morning. None of us wanted to stand alone for even a few steps. Briggs told us we would not go back inside the hill under any circumstances. He said we would wait for the survey crew and then leave the moment they arrived. He said they could handle whatever was down there. He tried to sound firm, but his voice was raw. His shirt was untucked and his right hand trembled when he tried to put the pistol back in his coat. Thomas stood by the tool shed with the door open and looked in at his brother's body. The stiff shape on the table felt unreal in daylight. The sun made everything look ordinary again. That bothered me more than the night. The normal light gave us no truth. It only forced us to live alongside what we already understood, but did not want to say. Sparrow ate nothing. He sat near the bunkhouse steps with his back pushed against the wall and his knees pushed up to his chest. He held the chalkboard he used in the room, but never looked at it. Alvarez walked the edge of camp in a slow circle, muttering and glancing at the hill every few seconds. Connolly polished the metal end of his pick while sitting on an overturned crate. He did not speak. He did not hum anymore. Briggs ordered me to burn the rope we had used inside the rooms. He said, anything that touched those spaces should be destroyed. I took a coil outside camp, piled brush, and lit it. The rope shrank and blackened fast. The smell was harsh. When I walked back, Alvarez asked if I felt anything different. I told him, no, but that was not fully honest. I felt a strange pressure inside my skull, not pain, not fear, something that sat below those things. 2 hours later, while the sun stood high, a long, sharp crack came from the direction of the hill. It sounded like a slab of stone snapping under strain. Then came a low, continuous grind of earth. We all turned toward the tunnel opening. The wooden beams around the entrance shifted slightly. Dust rose from the cracks and drifted into the air. The ground under our feet shook once with a short jolt. The vibration moved through the soles of our boots and then stopped. Connolly cursed under his breath. Sparrow closed his eyes and lowered his head. Briggs stood still for several seconds, then called all of us to the center of camp. He said if the hill was unstable, it could collapse and take us with it. He said we would move our gear to the far side of camp and wait there. He said nothing about lizard people or monsters or anything unseen. He refused to say the words, maybe because saying them would make them real in a way he could not reverse. We moved everything we could carry. We chose a place near the creek where the ground was open and flat. The sun reached it fully, and it felt safer than the shadows near the hill. Thomas would not move his brother's body. He said Eli would not be left alone. Briggs told him to bring the body. Thomas refused, so the body remained in the tool shed. By late afternoon, the wind picked up. Fine dust rose off the hill and blew toward the camp in thin curtains. It carried a faint smell that reminded me of the narrow room beyond the fork. Sharp, mineral, heavy. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, we heard the taps again. This time, they did not sound from the hill. They sounded from under the tool shed. The same slow rhythm as before. Two taps. Pause. Two taps. Pause. Exactly the same spacing as that first night when it started. Thomas drew his knife and walked toward the shed. I moved to follow him, but Briggs grabbed my coat sleeve and told me to stay put. Thomas never stopped. He walked straight inside. We heard his steps fade on the wood floor. A moment later, a single sharp slam of wood came from inside. Then silence. Briggs raised the pistol and ran toward the shed with Alvarez behind him. Connolly moved in behind them. I reached the doorway as Briggs yanked it open. Thomas was standing inside with both hands clenched around the edge of the work table. His shoulders rose and fell in shallow movements. His head bowed slightly. His brother lay right where we placed him. No movement, no shift. Nothing changed from the moment we left the body there that morning. Briggs called Thomas's name. No answer. He stepped closer and placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. When Thomas looked up, I saw something in his eyes that did not belong to a man standing in daylight. His pupils were wide. His jaw held tense in a way I had never seen. He whispered that something moved beneath the floor. He said he felt it press against the boards under his feet. The way he said it was not frantic. It was flat, like he had accepted it. We backed away and left the shed. We tried to talk Thomas into leaving. He would not. He said he would not abandon Eli. He sat down near the door of the shed with a knife in his right hand and the body of his brother behind him on the table. Night came with no color in the sky, just a rapid fade to dark. We lit 3 lamps and set them in a triangle around our new camp spot. No one slept. Sparrow sat between Connolly and me with his arms wrapped around himself. Alvarez stayed standing. He refused to sit. Briggs paced. His boots scraped the dirt in tight circles. Around midnight, the taps started again below the shed. Then the taps moved under the ground between the shed and the creek. Not fast, not loud, just closer. Then we heard a second set of taps farther back near the tunnel opening. Then a third set from farther right near the waste rock pile. 3 separate patterns moving at once. I felt every muscle in my body tighten at once. Sparrow's breathing turned short and fast. Connolly lowered his pick and rested it against his thigh because his hand shook too much to hold it level. The taps stopped. The silence lasted long enough to make us hopeful for 1 second. Then came a new sound, a solid drag across soil near the creek. Slow, long, very close. Briggs lifted the pistol toward the sound. His hand shook. He stepped backward until he stood beside us. The lamps flickered. Then we saw a shape in the darkness at the edge of the light. It crouched low with long limbs pressed close to the ground. Its skin was pale green and dry. Its head was narrow and elongated with flat, dark eyes set far apart. Its mouth opened slowly and showed rows of small, pointed teeth. It did not produce sound. It only breathed in short, shallow bursts. Behind it rose another shape, then another. We stood frozen. The lamps showed their movements in brief sways of shadow. The nearest one tilted its head in a short mechanical motion. It stepped forward into the outer ring of lamplight. Its skin had a pattern of overlapping ridges down the sides of its body. Its hands were long and ended in curved black claws. It stood upright now, taller than a man. Its chest rose and fell in slow rhythm. Briggs fired at its face. It did not fall. It turned toward him with no reaction on its face at all. And then it moved fast, faster than any man could move. It hit Briggs before I could track the movement. 1 second. It stood just inside the ring of lamplight. The next, it crossed the distance with no wasted motion. It struck his arm and sent the pistol out of his hand. The pistol spun in the air and hit the dirt 10 feet away. Briggs cried out and dropped to one knee. The creature's claws left 3 clean vertical cuts through Briggs' coat sleeve. Blood ran down his forearm fast. The creature did not follow through. It stepped back and watched us. Alvarez shouted that we had to fall back toward the creek. Connolly grabbed Sparrow by the collar and pulled him. I kept my eyes on the creature closest to us. Its dark eyes tracked every movement we made. Two more shapes moved into view behind it. All three formed a slow arc to block the path back toward the hill. They were not trying to force us back into the mine. They were pushing us farther away from the hill's base like we had trespassed. And this was their line. Thomas shouted from the shed that there were more under the floor. I could not see him through the open doorway, but his voice sounded different. Not panic. It had a dull certainty. Briggs forced himself to stand and held pressure on his arm. We backed toward the creek slowly. We kept our lamps between us and them. They responded by moving at the same pace, matching every step we took backward. When our boots hit the loose pebbles at the creek edge, the creatures stopped advancing. Their bodies stayed still. Their heads tracked us. The nearest creature raised its shoulder slightly in a small motion and let out a short dry hiss, like air force through narrow cartilage. Another hiss answered from the left, then silence again. Briggs whispered to check the water for deeper crossing. The creek was only knee-high but wide. Crossing in the dark would be dangerous. Alvarez said we did not have a choice. Sparrow said he could not swim well. Connolly told him he would carry him if needed. The creatures stepped backward as a group, not turning their backs. They moved toward the shed and stopped near the door where Thomas still sat. Alvarez started toward him, but Briggs grabbed his shirt and pulled him back. Briggs said Thomas made his choice, and we could not pull him out without getting cut down before we reached him. Alvarez yelled that we could not leave him in there. Briggs stared at the shed a long moment and said, if Thomas was staying, he was lost already. That sentence made Sparrow cry without tears or sound, just air moving out in small bursts. In the lamplight, I could see Alvarez's jaw tremble. Thomas did not react to our shouts. He sat inside that shed with his brother and the things outside the door. I did not know if he was waiting to die or if some part of him no longer wanted to leave. The creatures held around the shed in a ring. They were not rushing. They were waiting. We crossed the creek. Connolly lifted Sparrow on his back and kept his lamp held high. The water was cold and the stones underfoot were slick. My lamp dipped toward the surface, but I steadied it before the flame died. On the other side, we formed a tight cluster and moved deeper into the scrub. The lamp showed low brush and uneven ground. We climbed a small rise and looked back across the creek. The creatures stood at the edge of the water. They did not cross. They kept their positions and kept watching us. Their posture never changed. They never broke the pattern. The shed door shook once from an impact inside, then a second time. After the second, the lamplight flickering off the water showed two creatures push the door inward with slow, controlled force. They went inside. Thomas never made a sound. We turned away and left that camp for good. We walked toward the rail spur with only lamplight to guide us. The scrub and loose grit made the going slow. Briggs' wound bled through the cloth he tied around it, but he did not ask us to stop. Every few minutes, he looked back toward the hill, but he never brought up returning for Thomas. Alvarez muttered prayers under his breath the entire way. Sparrow clung to Connolly's shirt until his fingers cramped. After 2 hours of walking through rough country, our lamps began to burn low. The light thinned, and the flame flickered more often. We found a small wash with higher ground and packed dirt. We decided to rest there until first light. Connolly planted his pick in the dirt and sat with his back against it. Alvarez sat facing the direction we had come. Sparrow curled up on the ground and fell into a shallow sleep out of exhaustion. Briggs tried to sleep, but flinched every time the pain in his arm pulsed. My thoughts would not quiet. I could not shake the image of those creatures standing in the lamplight. Their stillness, their patience, their deliberate restraint. They could have torn us apart at any moment, but they didn't. They never moved in frenzy. They moved like creatures that had evolved underground with precise efficiency, with physiological confidence in their own advantage, with no fear response tied to violence. Just before dawn, Sparrow jolted awake from a nightmare. He said he saw a long corridor of smooth, dark stone and a trough filled with fresh blood. He said there were hands dragging something across the floor in slow repetition. He did not describe the hands. He covered his face and said he did not want to remember more. When daylight finally broke, The world looked flat and dry again. The hill behind us looked like any other western hill, with no sign of what lived beneath it. We continued walking toward the rail spur. The sun rose higher. The grit stuck in the creases of my eyes and made them burn. We reached the spur by afternoon. The small rail shack stood there with a hand pump and a short siding track. The water tasted metallic, but it was safe enough to drink. Briggs collapsed on the platform and leaned against the wall. He asked Connolly to check his arm. Connolly cut the sleeve away and looked at the wounds. The cuts were clean and deep. The edges were too smooth to be from rock. We waited there until dusk. No survey crew arrived. No one came down the rails. When the sky dimmed, Briggs said we would walk the rails through the night to reach the next camp. He said when we reached the next town, we would report everything exactly as it happened. He said the government could decide what to do, not the mining company, not us. We set off again. Walking the rails felt easier than crossing rough ground. Sparrow walked on the ties because he said it helped keep his balance. Alvarez kept glancing behind us every few miles. Connolly held his pick like a soldier holds a rifle. I walked beside Briggs so he would not stumble from blood loss. 2 hours after dark, we heard a single tap far behind us on the rails. Then silence. No second tap. No rhythm. Just one loud strike traveling along the steel track. Sparrow froze in place. Briggs told us to keep walking. We did. We pushed through dry wind and darkness until we reached lights on the horizon just before dawn. A telegraph office stood at the edge of the next settlement. Briggs went inside and I followed him. He came out 30 minutes later. He said messages were sent to the nearest law office and territorial officials. He said riders would go to retrieve the bodies at dry camp number 3. He said men would be sent to shut the mine permanently. We stayed in that settlement 3 days. During that time, none of us slept well. Sparrow vomited twice a day from nerves. Alvarez refused to enter any building with a cellar. Connolly could not stay indoors longer than an hour. Briggs lay in bed feverish and pale. His wound developed a foul smell. A doctor was brought in, but said the tissue looked poisoned in a way he could not identify. On the 4th morning, Briggs went still. He died before noon. His eyes stayed open. The doctor insisted on sealing his body immediately and burying him before sundown. We did not argue. That night, a lawman from another district arrived. He questioned all of us separately. We told him every detail. He wrote it all down, but did not look convinced. 3 days later, a telegraph operator told us a message came back from the recovery team that rode out to the old hill. They found the camp, the bunkhouses, the dumping area, the shed. They did not find a single body. Not Eli, not Thomas, not Briggs, not any sign of struggle. Every building was empty and clean on the inside. Tool racks were untouched. The tunnel opening had collapsed under its own weight. The hill was sealed. The ground around the shed showed no dents or drag marks. The operator asked if we had made the entire story up. None of us answered him. I left Nevada that same afternoon and never returned. Sparrow disappeared a year later in Idaho. No one knows what happened to him. Connolly died of pneumonia in 1909. Alvarez lived until 1938 and refused to talk about that winter ever again. I still dream about the lower room, the narrow dents in dust, the smell of old mineral air, the long, smooth trough carved with purpose. I know what we saw. I know what walked in that hill, and I know they let us leave.